Good evening, everyone. I'm Jackie Kemp, and I'm presenting tonight's show with guest Richard Thomson, who's MP for Gordon for the SNP, and he's actually in the Houses of Commons. So before we go to Richard to talk about the affairs of the day, I'm just going to read you a short update about what's been happening in the Ukraine. It's day 343 of the conflict. President Vladimir Zelensky has said that his administration is planning to introduce changes as part of an attempt to proceed with unusually rapid and complex negotiations to secure European Union membership. Ukrainian media has been reporting that two high-profile anti-corruption raids have been carried out this morning, targeting oligarch Igor Kolomoisky and former Interior Minister Arsen Avakov. El País is reporting that Spain will initially send between 4 and 6 Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. The US is readying more than $2 billion worth of military aid for Ukraine that's expected to include longer-range rockets for the first time, as well as other munitions and weapons, two US officials briefed on the matter told Reuters. The Kremlin said that longer-range rockets reportedly included in an upcoming package of military aid from the US to Ukraine would escalate the conflict but not change its course. Senior advisor to the Ukrainian president, Mikhailo Podolyak, said that talks were already underway on securing longer-range missiles and attack aircraft from foreign partners to help repel Russian forces. Western allies appear to have cooled on the idea of supplying F-16 and other fighter jets to Ukraine over the past 24 hours. Ukraine's state broadcaster is reporting that the Kinburn Peninsula, a strip of land that protrudes from the southern side of Kherson Oblast on the left bank of the Dnieper River, is in the grey zone with neither Ukrainian or Russian military fully in control. The UK Ministry of Defence latest intelligence update says that recent days have seen some of the most intense shelling of the conflict along the Dnieper River. This has included continuing shelling of Kherson. Vladimir Putin told a government meeting on Wednesday that shelling of Russian regions from Ukraine must not be permitted, and this was the task of the Defence Ministry. Austria's President Alexander van der Bellen and the Green Party's Vice President of the German Bundestag, Katrin Göring-Eckardt, both visited Kiev today. Ukraine should be able to join NATO as soon as the war is over, new Czech President-elect Petr Pavel said on Wednesday. Ukraine's grain harvest may decrease again in 2023 to 49 million tonnes, from around 51 million tonnes expected in 2022, Deputy Economy Minister Denis Kudin said on Wednesday. Belarus's armed forces are claiming that they're now in autonomous control of Russian-supplied nuclear-capable Iskander mobile guided missile systems. Latvia will not send its athletes to the 2024 Paris Olympics if competitors from Russia and Belarus are allowed to take part while the invasion of Ukraine is ongoing. So, there we are. What's your take on what's happening in Ukraine, Richard Thomson?
Well, it's been a wee while since I've been on, Jackie, but I think we're seeing some interesting developments. A few months ago, the provision of tanks would have been considered an unwarranted escalation, and certainly at that point, the Ukrainians seemed to be making a great deal of progress militarily with
Mm,
HIMARS, missile launching systems, which again, a few months prior to that would have been seen as an escalation. So I think it shows us a number of things, and one that Western powers who are supporting Ukraine's efforts to recover territory and restore its territorial and political sovereignty are becoming less inhibited about what sort of equipment
mm,
they're willing to provide. From a personal point of view, I think that's a good thing. I understand the need, and I've urged caution myself, but I think the longer this progresses, this is what's giving Ukraine the initiative, which will allow them to bring the Russians to the negotiating table, largely on Ukrainian terms rather than Russian terms. So seeing the tanks, particularly the German Leopard tanks, now beginning to be released for Ukraine, I think is interesting. And I think that the next step is to watch is about aircraft, because there's quite clearly a willingness in Eastern European countries allied with
yeah.
Ukraine to provide provide
Mhm.
fourth generation fighter bomber aircraft, and I think it remains to be seen whether or not that is the next. The next step that is taken, because that would certainly put the forces on a far more equal footing in terms of equipment and technologies. And given the the gumption and the skill that the Ukrainians have shown to date could very well turn things to their greater
their
advantage.
advantage. It's interesting, isn't it? I spoke to some ages ago. I was talking to some Russians in a hostel in Berlin, and their take on it was the only people who are going to gain from this are the arms manufacturers. And I sort of keep thinking about that when I sort of see people talking on the news about, oh, everyone wants the Leopard 2s because they're this and that, and it's obviously there is no alternative, but it's sort of tragic that it has come to this because all of this hardware is really gonna just it's gonna kill people, isn't it? Really, so
Well,
it's like
I agree entirely. I mean, it's sort of like you can say about any litigation in a law court that the only people who get rich out of it are the lawyers, and the same, the only beneficiary from a
yeah,
war is the balance sheets and the shareholders of the arms manufacturers. But nevertheless, the way to stop them benefiting and the way to restore
yeah,
the rules-based international order is for Putin to withdraw his forces and
yeah.
respect Ukrainian sovereignty.
I
And when you're
agree. I
faced with
mean,
somebody who's not willing to do that,
yeah, arguably it
none of the
shouldn't.
options are palatable.
Yes, arguably, it should have happened before now. It's kind of been allowed to escalate. Did you? I know that Boris Johnson said the other day that Putin had threatened to, you know, had threatened him with a missile. I mean, and I know Johnson isn't a particularly reliable source, but if Putin did say that, then it's quite extraordinary, isn't it, to think of threatening the head of another country like that with a missile? Do you think he said it or
Well,
not?
even if it was a bard, I honestly don't know. It certainly didn't appear in the readout of the conversation, but from Downing
Yeah.
Street. But I wouldn't have expected it to. Whether whether it was said in seriousness or as an attempt at a barbed jest, it seems to me at a time when the tensions were building, it was a pretty maladroit thing to say. But I think it's quite obvious
Scary.
that Mr. Putin really doesn't care about such niceties, and he thinks he has a superiority in terms of resources. He thinks he has a
Mm,
superiority in that he expects to be there longer than any of the democratically elected leaders currently ranged against him.
yeah.
So I think he's somebody who kind of lives outside those kinds of diplomatic norms, and thinks it can probably stories like that probably burnish his own reputation. So
Yeah.
you know,
And potentially
how,
war
if Boris
kind of,
Johnson told
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, Boris, I
but
was just going to say, Boris Johnson's the sort of guy, having observed him up close, that if he told me the sky was blue, I would still look out the window to check. But nevertheless, I think
yeah,
it's a story that adds nothing of consequence to what we already know, and I think we should
I know.
just
I don't like
focus on
Johnson
the
either, but
task at
Putin's
hand.
worse. Yeah, yeah. I mean, nobody likes Johnson, but Putin is obviously worse. I think. Would you agree with
Oh,
that?
without question, without question.
I mean, I tweeted earlier that would be about that, and I got a couple of responses saying, "Oh well, Putin doesn't tell as many lies as Johnson," and I was a bit like, "Well, the consequence of Putin's lies is pretty serious." Yeah.
Well,
Okay. Let's. Okay. So, Stephen Flynn defends the right to strike. I suppose most of our viewers will know that there's a strike bill going through Westminster, which will be imposed on Scotland because employment law isn't devolved, and the Labour Party actually abstained on the amendment that would have given the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments a say over this new draconian law. So Stephen Flynn issued a press release, and he said that independence is the only way to guarantee workers' rights are protected. In a speech at the Glasgow STUC rally, which is probably going on around now, Stephen Flynn will say MPO stands up for workers' rights and vigorously defends the right to strike. Ahead of the event, the SNP leader at Westminster warned the pay and conditions of workers will always be at risk under Westminster control because Scotland is powerless to prevent workers' rights being ripped up by the UK government. Labour MPs abstained on an SNP amendment to the strikes minimum service levels bill on Monday, which would have meant the provisions of the bill couldn't apply to Scotland without consent of the Scottish Parliament. The Labour Party previously worked with the Tories to block the devolution of employment law during the Smith Commission in 2014, and no mention of devolving employment law was included in Gordon Brown's recent report, despite promises about the closest thing to federalism. And the strikes bill sort of provides for um, people can be told that they have to work. People in health or educate potentially in education, in the workers, they can be told that they have to work to provide a minimum service level, and if they say that they want to strike, they can be sacked. What's your take on this, Richard?
Well, the right to withdraw your labour is a fundamental human right, and to be able to do so in an industrial dispute without consequences, I think a fundamental right of citizenship. So it's no surprise to see the Tories trying to take this away. I mean, they've been playing a very, very foolish game. As part of a kind of wide-ranging culture war that extends from everything from the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland, the aspiration to have one in Wales, to small boats in the Channel, to striking trade unions. The Tories are trying to fight a culture war to create a legion of angry voters that they think will go down and vote for them, because quite clearly they've made a complete hash of the economy, they've made a complete hash of Brexit. They've been in power for 13 years, the dodgy decisions are piling up round about them, they've got a cabinet full of people who are utterly disreputable in political terms, who oughtn't in any decent government to be there. So they're looking for something that they can enrage their core vote with to get them to turn out and vote. And they thought that they could range that against the train drivers. They've tried to demonise Mick Lynch, the train driver, the rail union leader. They thought they could mobilise public opinion against the nurses just a matter of months after they were urging everybody to applaud our heroes during the pandemic. And they also thought that they can range public support against striking teachers as well. And I think that the public are in a very different place. Nobody likes having their day disrupted, but at the same time, everybody can see the effects of the cost of living crisis. And I think it's pretty well burned in that everybody expects to be able to get a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. And it's clear that the economic crisis that we're in, and we've seen an IMF report published yesterday suggesting that the UK economy will not only shrink over the next 12 months, it will also perform even more poorly than any other major economy, including Russia, which is obviously
I
sanction
saw that.
hit. So,
Yeah, yeah,
so people can see the mess that the UK economy is in, and they know that it's not the fault of people who are asking for their wages to at least keep pace with the cost of
yeah,
living, particularly when wages in real terms have been
yeah.
falling.
And just
So this
yeah,
bill is all on the backdrop of that, and I think that they're making a load of spurious comparisons with European nations where similar minimum service levels are in. But the fact is, there's more tripartite working, more co-decision making takes place. It's a completely different environment, and nobody is
it
being
is.
threatened with loss of
It
their
is.
employment in Europe from that.
Yes,
So they're trying to
it
ram
is.
this through, as I say, as part
Yeah,
of an entirely bogus set of arguments, which is at the heart of the culture war, which they're hoping will help them
yeah.
sneak over the line come the
That's
next
true.
election.
That's true. And just to bring this back to a more positive note, if Scotland were independent, or even if Scotland had employment law that was devolved, we wouldn't have to waste sort of time and energy. I don't think there's any particular evidence that destroying workers' rights, is in any way boost the economy. And you see in many European countries, wages have been going up. The inflation's been going up there, right? But wages have been going up also, which means that people aren't struggling as much. So I think if you could sort of bring that, nobody in Scotland, or very few of Scotland's elected representatives, would support this bill. I assume, the Scottish Parliament, I'm sure, would overwhelmingly reject
Oh, I think
this
the
notion.
Scottish Parliament would give it short shrift if any government was foolish enough to try to introduce it. And I think you see a tale of two governments here. That obviously there have been strikes in Scotland, but one of the things that comes through uniformly is that the Scottish government has gone to the negotiating table in a constructive manner. Now it's
Mm.
obviously hidebound in many respects in terms of the totality of the resources that are available for pay settlements, but it succeeded in closing off a negotiation with the train drivers at ScotRail. Negotiations continue, but even where they haven't been able to reach a negotiated settlement with the trade unions, the atmosphere around the talks is completely different, and the unions, I think, are generally and genuinely appreciative of the way that the Scottish government has gone about
Yes.
this, in stark contrast to belligerent way that
Mhm.
their counterparts in Whitehall have gone about it.
Well, it's interesting that the Labour Party, don't want employment law to be defaulted. I mean, they clearly don't, because their argument is, well, we just need to improve employment situation for the whole UK. But their offer that long periods of conservative rule are a price worth paying, and that the Labour Party will be able to like magically put everything back together if they get 4 or 8 years in office, it's maybe wearing a bit thin.
Well, yeah, you know what? I mean, there's a reason I'm in the SNP, and yeah, I would like to see workers' wages improved right across the UK too. But I suppose that the real difference is that I don't take the view that just because I can't improve wages everywhere, I don't want to improve them in the jurisdiction where I can. And that's the thing, Scotland, whether it's on this or anywhere else, we're always being held back by having to go at the pace of the slowest hiker in the group. Now, I think that Scotland deserves better. Scotland's workers, Scotland's communities deserve better than that, and we should be able to forge ahead and make our own decisions. And I think Labour have had a number of opportunities to devolve employment law, and quite frankly, I'm fed up having to go at the speed of the Tory hiker in the UK. Let's just go at the speed that people in Scotland want to go to, and we'll
Yeah,
be
why
limited
not? Why
only by
not
the
devolve?
limits of our own resources and decisions.
I mean, I can't see any argument for not devolving it. Um, and also, just to finish that point, the bonfire of EU regulation has got a lot of workers' rights with they're ready to sort of strike a match to. So Dominic Raab, here we go. Dominic Raab facing fresh suspension calls over accusations of bullying. Dominic Raab is facing fresh calls to be suspended from his post after reports that three senior civil servants who worked with him had been interviewed by the official inquiry into his alleged bullying. Rishi Sunak has rejected calls to suspend Raab, the Justice Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister, despite the number of allegations against him increasing. It's been reported that Antonio Romeo, the permanent Minister of Justice, and Philip Rycroft, who ran the Brexit department while Brett Brad was in charge there, have both been witnesses in the investigation led by Adam Tolley, KC. The former Foreign Office Permanent Secretary, Simon MacDonald, is also understood to have spoken to the inquiry. Dave Penman, the General Secretary of the FDA union that represents senior civil servants, told BBC Radio 4's Today, if that was any other employee, if that was a permanent secretary in the civil service, they would in all likelihood be suspended from their job while that investigation took place. Mr. Rabb, who stayed in post while the inquiry is ongoing, has vowed to thoroughly rebut the former complaints. He said he's confident he acted professionally throughout his time in three different cabinet posts. Last week, Number 10 said the number of former allegations against Rabb remained at 8, but couldn't rule out each complaint, including multiple accusers. Maybe Dominic Raab since you work down there. What do you think about this?
Fortunately, no. Unfortunately, no, I don't know him particularly well. Obviously, I know who he is, the same as most other people do. But no, I think it's easy sometimes to say that there's no smoke without fire, but quite clearly there's a number of quite senior people who have come forward and appear to have given evidence of behaviours that, if they were true, would not be tolerated in any other workplace. And I think that it's a symbol of the weakness of Rishi Sunak that not only that Dominic Raab is there, but that others are also there. I mean, he had to eventually get rid of Nadhim Zahawi after saying move along, nothing to see here. And it turned out there was actually
Yeah,
rather a lot, in fact, to see.
yeah.
He's got Suella Braverman there, who had
Oh,
to
that's terrible.
resign
Mm,
for breaking the ministerial code, and was then, back at the Home Office little more than a week later, simply because she'd pledged her supporters to Sunak. So
yeah,
I think Sunak has inherited a lot of detritus from his predecessors simply because he felt that was what he needed in order to shore himself up sufficiently to see off Boris Johnson. And he promised to lead a government based on competence and integrity. Well, we're at the 100-day mark, and I think the evidence is mounting that
yeah,
he's doing nothing of the sort. There is precious little evidence to
yeah.
support that. And the number of absolute shockers that are in his cabinet, I think, is testament to
Yeah.
that.
They're a pretty talentless crew. I suppose it is a particular faction of what was once quite a broad conservative party, and they're sort of they're at the dregs of the barrel now. It seems. I don't know if you'd agree
Well, I
with that
think there's
statement.
hardly anybody who hasn't had a ministerial post out of the entirety of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, but certainly this lot don't inspire confidence, they don't exude competence, and I think it's soon going to be
Yeah.
if there's any justice, they'll soon
Nadim,
be out.
the Nadim Zahawi stuff was actually shocking. Even though I'm pretty unshockable, but now, but I couldn't believe he was still in post after negotiating his own fine with his department when he was chancellor. It seemed pretty cut and dried. That shouldn't be allowed. What they used to call a conflict of interest. So now we're on to Scotland's fishing industry. Um, One of the leading figures in Scotland's fishing industry has condemned Brexit, saying it's delivered nothing for Scotland's fisheries. Mike Park, chief executive of the Scottish White Fish Producers Association, said that the fishing industry has struggled to get more quotas and is costing more and more to export fish from Scotland to Europe. Mr. Park also added that a lot of people in the industry feel let down by Brexit. Commenting, SNP MP for Gordon, Richard Thomson, that's you, said, Scotland's fishing industry has faced a betrayal at the hands of Brexit. Costs have soared, and getting their world class produce to the continent is becoming harder and harder. The only way the industry can flourish again is with independence, rejoining the European Union and the single market. Our fishing sector is just one of a number of industries that have been sacrificed for the Tories' Brexit obsession. Scotland's fishing, food and drink, and farming sectors have been decimated by Brexit. Um, and that's a very apposite phrase, decimate, because the Russian the Romans used to kill one man in every 10, I think, to sort of encourage the others. So yeah, it's kind of sort of what's happened. A tenth of it is probably gone. So fishing. I suppose you've got a lot of fishing people in your constituency.
No, not really. It's more Banff-and-Buchan and Murray, just slightly to the north and the northwest that do. But nevertheless, there's a huge community of affinity with the fishing industry right across northeast Scotland. And I think that the reason that this is such a salient issue is that fishing became an almost totemic issue during the Brexit referendum because there'd always been a resistance to the common fisheries policy and in parts of the Scottish fishing industry, certainly in the northeast, the whitefish sector, and there was a feeling that if only they could be rid of this pesky policy, then there would be and they actually used this phrase, a sea of opportunity. And there was plenty of people, absolute chancers like Bertie Armstrong and others who were going around promulgating this myth that's turned out to
Yeah,
be absolute codswallop. Because there's two sides to every equation. And for all that, yes, the United Kingdom would take over its territorial waters to the full 200-mile limit and would theoretically increase greatly the amount of fish it could catch within those waters. The fleet wasn't of a scale to do that. It was still going to have to negotiate quota. It's lost the ability to do quota swaps for species, and because we always fished in areas outside that 200-mile limit. But the biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems, was in terms of the restrictions that we now have on the migrant labour that was coming in and working in the processing sector, but also the ability to export, because now every consignment of food and drink that's leaving Scotland or any part of the UK for that matter, except Northern Ireland, to go to the European Union, has to be accompanied at great expense by an export health certificate signed off either by a vet or by
yeah,
an council environmental health officer. Excuse me. So
yeah.
there has been that. So there was always two sides to that equation, and I think that's what's really come home to roost now
Yeah,
is that you can catch as much fish as you like, but if there's nobody to sell it
yeah.
onto, or if you're only able to catch the wrong type of fish, that's obviously a very
Right.
simplistic view, but it's at the heart of how the fishermen have been let down here. And
And to
they
sort of
went
bring it
all in
back
on
to
Brexit, and they were entitled to
yeah,
expect something a hell of a lot better than they've got. And
they were
independence and being at the
yeah,
top table is the only way we're going to get back to a position where we can give
yeah,
Scottish fishermen in the processing sector the priority
yeah.
that they deserve.
I mean, I guess to bring it back to sort of a positive note, if an independent Scotland back in the EU, then Scotland would have a seat at the table, which it's never had because in the past, when the UK was kind of negotiating on behalf of Scotland's fishing industry, they weren't that bothered about it really. It was, well down their list of priorities. So I guess the sort of future, it might be better for the fishing industry. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, I'd like to think I'm always positive, and that was where I was taking my remarks at the end. That, if we're at the top table, we can make decisions in the interests of our industry and our processors, the industry as a whole, and we can get back to doing what we do best, which is catching, preparing, processing, selling, and eating a world-class product that we can take to for our closest neighbours to enjoy and pay for. And that's what's
Yeah.
been hit so hard by this botched Brexit.
Yeah. And that's what we need. Okay, so we're kind of slightly behind, so we're just going to move on quickly to next. This is a very big story. This is something that actually keeps me up at night. The UK government accused of voter suppression. The SNP has accused the UK government of a policy which will restrict the voting franchise after it was revealed that only 10,000 people in the UK have applied for government issued voter ID. It means only around 0.5% of those who might need the document have obtained a suitable form of ID that's required to vote in all parliamentary elections across Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. That's all Westminster elections because Scotland controls the franchise only for Holyrood. Government research has found that up to 2 million people currently lack photo ID as a recognisable picture of them as required under the new law. And it's not just any photo ID, it's only government issued photo ID. So it's like passport, driving licence, um, a matriculation card from university isn't acceptable. So what's your view about this voting photo ID?
Well, I think it's absolutely dreadful. I mean, what the Tories are doing is quite blatant. There's no evidence of any substantial voter fraud at all in any part of the UK. Not even, I think, these days on postal voting. Now that the rules around that have been tightened up, what they're clearly trying to do is make it as hard as possible for certain groups of people to vote, and those are the groups who are least like the lower socio-economic groups that are less likely to vote Conservative, but are also less likely perhaps to have a passport or a driving licence or any of the other approved forms of identification that you're referencing there.
Yes.
So I think this is pretty transparent, and that alongside their attempts to fuse wedge issues and dog whistles in a culture war, I think they want to drive up the
God.
turnout in the voters that they can anger and drive down the turnout in the voters that might be angered with the
Well,
Conservatives. And
um,
it's a
old
pretty
age pen
transparent ploy.
Old age pensions bus passes are acceptable, but very little ID that's normally possessed by younger people. But it's great that the Scottish Government's under 22 free bus pass thing. That's acceptable for voter ID. So we should really be encouraging any young person to get that because a lot of young people don't have, passport, driving license, of course, and they're expensive. So I think that it's going to be awful. It's really upsetting to be turned away from the polling station. If that happens to someone, they might not go back again. It might suppress the voting for a long time. It's just going to be
Exactly.
really upsetting. It's just going to be awful. I'm upset about it, and I think we have a very robust address based system because people in the office, people in the vote in the polling station, they know the streets. So if 50 people tried to vote from one flat, they would know it wasn't possible. So I think we don't. It is very political, as you say. So yeah, if you know a young person, make sure they've got their under 22 card. Um, um, we have the IFS says UK benefit changes have pushed people into dead end low paid jobs. Tougher benefit rules have boosted employment in the UK in the past 25 years, but only at the expense of trapping workers in dead end jobs, according to a leading think tank. The Institute for Fiscal Studies says successive waves of welfare change since the late 90s had imposed more stringent conditions on those claiming jobless benefits and increased incentives to find a job. According to the Institute, a low earner with children in 1997 to 98 on average lost 50p in reduced benefit for every pound. Today that figure's 38p, but the incentive to move from part to full time work has been weakened. Um, so this reflects changes in the underlying nature of low income in the UK, to which the benefit system naturally responds with high employment and chronic low earnings growth, meaning that increasing share of the lowest income families contain someone in paid work. I think that's something we're all very familiar with. The working poor. Um, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's done a lot of work on that. People not earning enough to make a living.
Well, that's it
Richard,
exactly. I mean, I can remember a period when I was unfortunately unemployed, and I I think I always felt under a little bit of pressure that they wanted me to. Although they cut me some slack for the first few months, it was getting to the point where they were pushing me to take whatever was available rather than what was necessarily the right job for me. But I think, in the end, I worked through that and 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 got through it. But I think that there is a temptation, there is this desire to get people out and working again as the government sees it. And I think that there are traps in the benefit system still that provide a reverse incentive to actually go out and work. But also, there's that determination to push people into any kind of job, whether it's suitable or not. Now, I think we have to recognise that as human beings, we're more than just working units and consuming units. We all deserve to have opportunities to do something that fulfills us as best we can, and that there always has to be an element of choice there, and that it's the duty of the state and the rest of society to support people in that. So I think that the desire to force people out onto the workforce at any cost, whether the opportunities are suitable or not, it's not necessarily good for those who go on and employ them. It's not good, but it's certainly not good for the individuals to do that. So what we need is a much smarter way of supporting people to get back into work and to find ways to make the best possible contribution that they can.
yeah, and more opportunities, yeah, for people. Um, so, just as an aside, my first job after university was I was a tree surgeon. There's this thing called the community program where you got the union rate for the job, and it was like 2.5 days. And I thought it would be fun to be a tree surgeon, but I was a really terrible tree surgeon. Like someone joined, and after about 2 hours, they were better than me, and I was like, "This is, I'm not gonna be any good at this." So I had to leave. But it was interesting to have the opportunity to try something like that. So, the Royal Navy has ordered an investigation into nuclear submarine repaired with glue. The Royal Navy's ordered an urgent investigation amid claims that workers on a Trident nuclear armed submarine fixed broken bolts in the vessel's reactor chamber using glue. The faulty repairs on the cooling pipes aboard HMS Vanguard were found after one of the bolts fell off during an inspection, according to media reports. The bolt heads originally came off due to over tightening, but rather than replace the damaged shafts, staff at the defence contractor Babcock implemented a quick fix and glued them back on. Engineers at the contractor reported it as a procedural glitch after the problem was found, but did not mention the botched nature of the repair. The glued bolts held insulation in place on the coolant pipes in the nuclear reactor and were found just as workers were set to fire it up to full power for the first time, the newspaper reported. Investigator will trawl report records of repairs to find out when the botched work occurred and who was responsible. A Ministry of Defence spokesperson said that a defect was found on HMS Vanguard while in dry dock, and that was promptly reported and fixed. Have you got anything to say on that one, or should we? We could just drop that. We could just leave that there.
I think
If you
it's
don't
just
have,
open-mouthed astonishment is the best I can muster up for that.
I know
That one,
it's
it absolutely beggars belief.
well. Someone has blundered, eh? Um, Kamala Harris to attend Tara Nichols' funeral in Memphis. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris will attend the funeral of Tara Nichols, the black man who died 3 days after Memphis police officers savagely beat him following a traffic stop last month, the White House said. Mr. Nichols will be eulogized by the Rev. Al Sharpton during the service at Mississippi Boulevard Christian Church in Memphis on Wednesday afternoon, a service delayed from a planned morning start by adverse weather conditions. Family members of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, victims of high profile police killings in 2020, will also attend. Thousands of mourners are expected to attend a service described as a chance to celebrate and remember the 29-year-old's life rather than focus on the gruesome way he died. The Shelby County District Attorney Steve Mulroy said on Tuesday prosecutors could bring further criminal charges against officers and others in connection with Nichols' death, after mounting criticism over how Mulroy's office and Memphis police have handled the case. 5 officers, all black, were charged last week with second-degree murder and dismissed. The department confirmed on Monday that a 6th officer, Preston Hemphill, who is white, was suspended soon after the attack, but wasn't criminally charged. It's really devastating, isn't it? That an awful case, really upsetting. Um, Yeah, there's been quite a lot of police misconduct stories recently, hasn't there?
Well, yes, I mean, I think this case is particularly shocking, not least for the trivial, nature. In fact, it was, I think I'm right in saying it was just basically a random stop. There was no evidence that Mr. Nichols had done anything wrong at all, and it was a police tactical unit that's now been a tactical unit that's now been disbanded that was at the heart of this, and I think it shows in yet another police force in America a breakdown in leadership, a breakdown in the
Yeah,
culture that's there, not just with the level of force that is allowed to be used ordinarily, but also the culture that goes on round about that.
yeah,
And I just think it's absolutely dreadful that effectively, what ought to be a routine traffic stop for so many
yeah.
people of colour turns into turned into effectively a death sentence. And you really have to wonder what's going through the minds of the police officers, knowing full well that they have body cams that are gathering evidence. I mean, they must think that they are able to carry out such acts in such ways with impunity. And as shocking and as outrageous as what we've witnessed here is, excuse me, and let me commend at this point the dignity of Mr. Nichols' mother. I honestly don't know how in God's name she can be so focused and so I can't even think of the word, but just so so focused and so in calling for
Yeah,
calm. I'm not sure I would have the presence of mind if that was any child of mine that had experienced that
yeah.
at any age. So I
But
mean,
then
she is
at
a
least they've
remarkable.
said what really
She's a
happened.
remarkable lady. Let me finish.
Yeah,
She's a
she is.
remarkable lady,
Yeah,
and I just,
yeah, she is.
it's
Yeah,
it's quite astonishing that the police officers thought they could get away with this, and I suppose the fact that we're finding out about it just goes to show that there are good people in the system who are willing to do what is right and stand up for what is right, and we need more of them to be calling out this sort of
yeah.
bad police behaviour
It's-
wherever it occurs, in whichever country it occurs.
Yeah, so Sheikh Boya, his family were initially told that he'd been found on the street and that two people, they were the police, they told the family a completely erroneous story. So I guess, and it's taken an awful long time for what happened there to come out. It is awful. It's really awful. But I suppose that level of transparency is important, and everyone, we need to know what happened. It shouldn't have taken 7 years to find out what happened to Jacob Boyer. Is my point.
Hmm. No,
Have
I
an
agree
inquiry.
entirely.
So to move on, the Guardian's reporting that the world's biggest fossil fuel firms profited in Myanmar after the coup. In the last 2 years since a murderous junta launched a coup in Myanmar, some of the world's biggest oil and gas service companies continue to make millions of dollars from operations that have helped to prop up the military regime, according to a report in The Guardian. The Myanmar military seized power in February 2021, and according to the UN Special Rapporteur, is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity daily. About almost 3,000 people, including children, pro democracy activists, and other civilians, have been killed, according to the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners. Amid this violence, leaked Myanmar tax records and other reports appear to show that US, UK, and Irish oil and gas field contractors, which provide essential drilling and other services to Myanmar's gas field operators, have continued to make millions in profits in the country after the coup. The documents were obtained by Transparency, non-profit distributed denial of secrets, and analysed by Myanmar activist groups. Investigative journalism organisation Finance Uncovered and The Guardian. Documents suggest that in some cases, the subsidiaries of major gas field services firms continued working in Myanmar, um, even when they were warned that there were significant risks in doing business in the country. On Tuesday, the US, UK, Australia, and Canada announced more Myanmar sanctions, including on the managing director of the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, but they stopped short of sanctioning the oil company itself. Last February, the EU became the first jurisdiction to announce sanctions against Moog, the Myanmar oil and gas entity, and because of human rights violations in Myanmar. The EU sanctions prohibit European companies from working on Myanmar's oil and gas fields, but the US and UK have not yet introduced similar measures. And I know someone who's just come back from Cox's Bazar, and he's come back partly because the UK government's funding to the refugees there is pretty much drying up because they are now spending so much of their overseas budget on housing asylum seekers in the UK, and also Boris Johnson reduced the percentage of GDP. So actually, Britain has a huge responsibility for what happened in what used to be Burma, which was a British colonial possession, and Britain's fingers are all over that. And it's really tragic that they're not doing more to help the million refugees that are in the Cox's Bazar, and and that they're not imposing sanctions, because actually it is very much a British interest, British area. What's your comment on the Myanmar news?
Well, I think that it's pretty shocking that we continue to uh, be so reliant on globally on oil and gas that's coming from regimes as unsavoury as uh, as that one. I think it shows the value of the fact that we're very fortunate in the fact that we have our own hydrocarbons in Scotland that we're in a position to be able to exploit. But nevertheless, it shows the wisdom of making a dash for renewables using carbon capture as a transition uh,
Mm,
as a transition
yeah,
a transitionary technology. But ultimately, we need to be weaning ourselves away from that, not just for climatic reasons, not just for reasons of domestic uh, energy security, but also for very sound geopolitical reasons that we're not overly dependent on dictators like Vladimir Putin, but also so that we're able to express, we're also able to ensure that unsavoury dictatorships like that in Myanmar are unable to prop themselves up because of their access to resources of that kind, and it makes it much more easy to have the kind of conversation, exert the kind of sanctions that we might wish to do. Certainly, the European Union appears to have had the courage of its convictions in that. And I think it's rather telling that the UK, which is was the largest oil producer, or Scotland by default in the European Union, even with that very considerable resource on its back door, still can't bring itself to say what we would expect any decent government, I think, to say about the atrocities that are carried out.
yeah. I mean, I can't understand why the UK isn't doing more. I mean, if the EU is doing the sanctions and the UK is in a position to know exactly they know a lot more about Myanmar because of the fact they've got these historic links. Why aren't they doing the sanctions?
It's a very good question. I wish I knew the answer.
Yeah, it's rubbish. That's my view. The Scottish government support plans for wild salmon recovery. Um, a comprehensive plan to ensure the recovery of wild Atlantic salmon populations in Scotland has been published. Developed in partnership with stakeholders, the Wild Salmon Strategy Implementation Plan covers five priorities: managing recreational angling, understanding pressure in marine and coastal environment, international collaborations, modernising legislation, improving the condition of rivers. The plan brings together a range of actions being undertaken across government which will benefit wild salmon recovery. Examples include improving salmon habitat through peatland restoration, improved water quality, improving wastewater treatment works, removing barriers to migration such as weirs associated with historic industry. Salmon are sensitive to rising water temperatures and riverside tree planting projects. Delivery group involving a range of stakeholders will oversee the progress of the plan and publish an annual report. Analysis of the environmental and socioeconomic benefits arising from a healthy wild salmon population will also ensure the value of the species is recognised. Launching the plan at the opening of the salmon fishing season on the Tweed, Mary Goujon, the Rural Affairs Secretary, said Scotland is recognised globally as a stronghold for Atlantic salmon, but statistics show a downward trend in the numbers returning to Scottish rivers. It's vital that we act together at home and overseas, using our collective resources, knowledge, and expertise to ensure a bright future for this iconic species. Um, and the plan, working with a range of partners, addressing the issues. Um, and I'm sure we'd all love to see a recovery of the salmon population. I noticed they don't mention that there's an issue with escaped farmed salmon, which I believe obviously breed with the wild population and um, uh, you know uh, have a detrimental effect on their ability to return. I believe. What do you think
Well,
about?
well, I very much welcome this initiative. I mean, yes, there's an issue, as you say, with escaped farm salmon breeding, but I think there are other steps that that can be taken, and I think this report sums them up quite nicely because, excuse me, oh, I've got the winter bug this week, it would seem. But there are an awful lot of salmon fishing. It's not it supports an awful lot of jobs. It brings a great amount of investment. It brings a great amount of tourism to the area, and of course, it's one of Scotland's most iconic products and an already pretty iconic suite of food and drink products. So I think things like examining where the water courses have been altered by humans, and with how you can change that to the advantage of the fish. What you can do to protect the spawning grounds, how rivers are managed. Things around about water abstraction, and how you can balance the needs of the health of the river with the needs of farmers to abstract water to grow crops sometimes. I think there's a whole range of interactions there that I would hope that this report gets into so that we can so that we have a clear strategy of the direction that we should be pulling in and the kind of interventions that are going to be looked at in order to, as I say, protect not just one of Scotland's most iconic species, but also the iconic landscapes and waterscapes that surround them.
Fish, aren't they? It's incredible what they can do. Um, so I think that's all of the stories that we've got on the list. So we kind of rattled through the some of those last ones, um, and just to sort of finish up, what are your sort of thoughts going forward? I mean, what do you see as being some of the big issues that you're going to be working on in Westminster?
Well, in terms of me personally, I've recently been given another role in the SNP front bench down here covering international trade, taking over from my good friend and colleague Drew Henry, the SNP member for Inverness, Nairn, Badenoch and Strathspey. Now, it's international trade is an area which I'm not unfamiliar with because for the last 18 months or so, I've also been on the SNP front bench covering Welsh affairs, but particularly Northern Irish affairs, and that's two responsibilities, areas of responsibility that I'm delighted to say I've also kept in the recent reshuffle by Stephen Flynn, in addition to international trade. Now, the reason Northern Ireland is so pivotal, of course, to international trade is because of the issues that have surrounded Northern Ireland since Brexit over the Northern Irish Protocol. Now, that was designed to prevent a situation whereby there needed to be border and customs checks on the island of Ireland. And there's a number of reasons, both practical but also historical, that I'm sure I won't need to go into for any of our viewers this evening. But obviously the protocol has caused a great deal of concern in parts of Northern Irish society, amongst unionists primarily, who believe that it has effectively created a trade border down the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And frankly, it's hard to argue with them that that's what's happened because that's exactly what Boris Johnson did under the nonsense notion that he was somehow getting Brexit done. I'm sure those of us of a certain age will remember exciting TV programmes, being told by the continuity announcer on the BBC from London, and it would then come up, except for viewers in Scotland who are going to see, well, this Brexit deal might as well have had that little asterisk there which said, except for viewers in Northern Ireland. So there's a whole range of issues around about trade there that we need to get our teeth into, because Brexit most assuredly is still not done, and the UK government is most assuredly still negotiating, not just with the European Union over this stuff, but also negotiating with itself. And it's quite interesting to see the little huddles of backbench Tory right wingers trying to, having discussions about what would and wouldn't be acceptable in their eyes here. Now, I've taken a pretty straightforward, pragmatic view of this. So obviously, we're in the SNP. We want Scotland to be independent. We want Scotland to be independent as soon as possible. That should go without saying. But where we're at with this is that what we also want is that to have as few trade barriers as possible between whether between Scotland and the rest of the UK, Scotland and Northern Ireland, Scotland and the European Union. We want as few trade barriers as possible, whether we're in the United Kingdom, as we still are for the moment, or whether, as we all earnestly hope, outside the United Kingdom and fully engaged with the single market and the customs union of the European Union in that sense. So there's a number of issues that cut right across these briefs, which are of tantamount importance to Scotland, not just at the moment, but also the Scotland of the future that we hope to create. And in between times, there's also the measures that can be taken to try and boost trade from Scotland. We've mentioned in an earlier item tonight about the problems that there are for our fishing industry in terms of exporting not just the primary caught product, but also the finished product. But we in Scotland produce about 25% of the UK's total food and drink exports by value. Now, obviously, Scotch whisky helps enormously with that, but we've got a large number of SME businesses that are ripe for growth, that are ripe for opportunities, but are being hamstrung at the moment by the additional red tape. I mean, when idiots like
Sure.
Jacob Rees-Mogg were, I'm sure he won't mind me calling him that, when he was talking about cutting red tape after Brexit, little did we know that he meant he was actually going to take a pair of scissors and cut the red tape sideways and make twice as much of the damned stuff as there ever was beforehand.
Yeah.
And that's what our exporters are facing. SMEs have got great growth potential, but often they're not set up, equipped, capable of navigating, taking on some of the risks that there are round about the increased bureaucracy there. That's why it's so important Scotland gets
Good
back into
Scottish
the
government
European Union,
export. I mean, good
incidentally.
Scottish.
That's why it's so important. But in terms of looking at some of the other opportunities that there are around the world, we need to make sure that we're fully taking them. We didn't need to leave the European Union, incidentally, to take them on. But Scotland has some world-beating products here, and they've got some potentially world-beating
Yeah.
businesses. And I
I
want
read
to be
somewhere.
getting into not
Sorry,
just I want to get into the nitty-gritty about that, about what we can do to try and create the opportunities within the UK
yeah,
at the moment, but hopefully in the not too distant future, once we're out of
in
this
the
place, to
yeah,
see how
yeah.
we can really make that food and drink industry thrive and prosper for Scotland.
I read somewhere that only 2 pence out of a bottle of whiskey comes to Scotland. Of course, all the excise goes to the government in London, I guess. But yeah, so it's interesting things like the new ferry from Rosyth to Zeebrugge. Is that part of the kind of getting Scotland ready for like a post UK exporting future?
I think so. I mean, you only need to look at the Brexit busting ferries that now sail out of the Irish Republic, Rosslare to the continent, given since there's so much red tape associated with transversing the land bridge of England, as they used to call it. So I think post independence, there's a number of opportunities. Right now, the UK isn't checking any of the goods that comes in. So, it's a really, really dangerous situation that the UK government has put us in. Instead of taking back control, they've given it away, and that's harmful for food security and animal health and human health. But having direct links to the mainland Europe once again, I think we'll always have a very, very close trading partners in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and we want to have as few trade barriers with them as we can. But getting back into that market of 27 different countries,
Yeah,
600 million people, And having our direct freight linkages, I think, is a very, very
important.
crucial component of the choices
Because
that we should be making positively for the
supply
future here.
chains break at the ends, don't they? And when we saw that when there was trouble with cabotage and there wasn't any deliveries, the biggest problem was in the Highlands and rural Scotland because that's where if everything comes through London, then they take what they want and then send it further north. And so, yeah, those it's great that we've got that ferry link, but we need more, I should think, to kind of be prepared for the problems that might arise. But thank you very much. So that's brought us to the end of our allocated time. That's it for this evening. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who's signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. Good night, and thank you for watching. Thank you very much, Richard. That's been fascinating. Great to hear
Great pleasure.
your take
Thank
on
you.
some of these important issues. Thank you very much.